The emergency alarm pierced through the aircraft cabin at 35,000 feet. But it wasn't mechanical failure that would determine whether 180 passengers lived or died that day. It was the split-second decision of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of survival in the world's most dangerous skies, now forced to use every deadly skill she'd learned to save innocent lives while pretending to be just another terrified passenger. Flight 447 had been in the air for exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes when Sarah Chun felt the familiar weight of her military training settle into her muscles like an old jacket. The feeling came without warning, triggered by something most passengers wouldn't have noticed, the subtle shift in cabin pressure that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the three men who had just moved from their scattered seats to positions that created perfect coverage of all emergency exits. Sarah had been enjoying the rare luxury of flying as a passenger rather than piloting the aircraft. After 15 years of flying everything from fighter jets to transport planes for the Navy, sitting in seat 14C with a paperback novel felt almost decadent. She was on her way to San Diego for a well-deserved vacation, her first real break since completing her latest classified mission over the Pacific. The book in her hands was a romance novel, something she never had time to read during deployments, and she'd been looking forward to losing herself in someone else's drama for once. But now, as she watched the three men move with practiced coordination, her vacation mindset evaporated completely. Her training kicked in with the precision of a Swiss watch, and, suddenly, she wasn't Sarah Chun, the off-duty naval officer anymore. She was Lieutenant Commander Chun, a woman who had survived dogfights over hostile territory, emergency landings on aircraft carriers in stormy seas, and situations that would have broken lesser pilots. The first man was tall and lean, probably in his 30s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested either extreme anxiety or carefully controlled aggression. He had taken a seat near the front emergency exits, positioning himself where he could see both the cockpit door and the main cabin. The second man was stockier, older, with hands that moved constantly, touching his jacket pocket, adjusting his watch, smoothing his hair. He'd moved to the middle of the aircraft, near the overwing exits. The third man was the one that made Sarah's blood run cold. He was calm, almost serene, as he settled into a seat near the rear of the plane. This was the one in charge, she realized. The one who would give the orders. Sarah forced herself to keep reading her book, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement while her mind calculated angles, distances, and possibilities. She noticed things that the flight attendants hadn't picked up on yet. The way the men avoided making eye contact with each other despite their obvious coordination. How they each carried small carry-on bags that they kept close to their bodies. The way they seemed to be waiting for some invisible signal. 23 minutes later, the signal came. It started with the tall man standing up abruptly and walking toward the front of the aircraft. Sarah watched as he approached the galley where two flight attendants were preparing the drink service. She couldn't hear the words he spoke, but she could see the immediate change in their body language. The first attendant, a young woman with blonde hair, went rigid with fear. The second, an older man with silver hair, took a step backward and raised his hand slightly. That's when Sarah saw the knife. It was small, probably ceramic to avoid metal detectors, but in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, it might as well have been a sword. The tall man held it low, out of sight from most passengers, but positioned so the flight attendants could see it clearly. He was speaking to them in low, urgent tones, and Sarah could see their faces pale as they understood whatever demands he was making. The stocky man in the middle of the cabin stood up next, reaching into his jacket pocket. Sarah couldn't see what he pulled out, but the gesture was enough to make several nearby passengers look up from their magazines and phones with expressions of growing concern. A woman across the aisle from him gasped and shrank back in her seat. The third man, the calm one in the back, remained seated. He didn't need to stand up to control the situation. Sarah could see him scanning the cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to read a crowd, looking for potential threats, identifying passengers who might cause trouble. His gaze swept over Sarah briefly, and she forced herself to look down at her book, projecting the image of just another nervous passenger trying to avoid eye contact. But, inside, her mind was racing through possibilities and calculations with the speed and precision that had kept her alive through countless dangerous missions. She knew that in situations like this, time was the most critical factor. Every second that passed allowed the hijackers to establish more control, to spread more fear, to make rescue more difficult. But she also knew that acting too quickly, without proper assessment and planning could result in disaster. The blonde flight attendant was now walking slowly down the aisle toward the cockpit, her face pale, but her movements controlled. The tall man followed a few steps behind her, and Sarah realized they were going to take control of the flight deck. Once they had the pilots, the situation would become exponentially more dangerous. Aircraft were incredibly vulnerable when their control systems were compromised, and at 35,000 feet, there were no good options for emergency response. Sarah had to make a decision, and she had to make it now. She thought about the passengers around her, families returning from vacation, business travelers, elderly couples, children. She thought about her own family, her parents who still worried every time she deployed, her sister who called her a hero but had no idea what that word really meant. She thought about her training, about the oath she had taken to protect and serve, about the weight of responsibility that came with the skills she possessed. Most of all, she thought about what would happen if she did nothing. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Sarah closed her book carefully, placed it in the seat pocket in front of her, and began to move. Her first priority was to assess the full scope of the threat. She needed to know how many hijackers there were, what weapons they possessed, and what their likely objectives were. From her position in seat 14C, she had a good view of most of the main cabin, but she needed to be certain she wasn't missing anyone. She stood up slowly, as if heading to the bathroom, and began walking toward the rear of the aircraft. As she passed the stocky man in the middle section, she got a clear look at what he was holding, another ceramic knife, similar to the one the tall man had shown the flight attendants. But there was something else in his other hand, something that made her stomach clench with recognition. It was a small electronic device with a simple switch and a digital display. Sarah had seen enough improvised explosive devices during her military service to recognize the basic components, even disguised in civilian clothing. The situation had just become exponentially more complex. These weren't just hijackers looking to take control of the aircraft for ransom or political demands. They were prepared to destroy the plane entirely if their objectives weren't met. That changed everything about how she would need to approach the problem. As she continued toward the back of the aircraft, Sarah noticed other details that painted a grim picture of what was unfolding. Several passengers had their phones out, probably trying to text family members or call for help, but she could see the frustration on their faces as they realized they had no signal. The aircraft's communication systems had likely been compromised already, which suggested a level of technical sophistication that went beyond simple terrorist tactics. The calm man in the back row looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes met directly. Sarah felt the weight of his scrutiny, the way he seemed to be evaluating her as a potential threat. She forced herself to project nervousness and confusion, the natural response of a civilian passenger in a crisis situation. But behind that facade, she was studying him just as intently, noting the way he carried himself, the alertness in his posture, the quick intelligence in his dark eyes. This was clearly the leader, and he was no amateur. Sarah could recognize military training when she saw it, even disguised in civilian clothes. The way he positioned himself to monitor the entire cabin, the calm confidence with which he surveyed the situation, the strategic thinking that had placed his men at optimal positions throughout the aircraft. These were not the actions of random terrorists. This was a carefully planned operation with specific objectives and professional execution. Sarah continued to the bathroom at the rear of the aircraft, taking the opportunity to complete her reconnaissance. There were definitely only 3 hijackers, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant she wasn't outnumbered beyond any hope of success. Bad because it suggested they were confident that 3 men were sufficient to control nearly 200 passengers and crew members. That kind of confidence usually came from superior weapons, training, or backup plans that made resistance seem futile. Inside the small bathroom, Sarah allowed herself 30 seconds of rapid tactical thinking. She reviewed everything she had observed, cataloged the resources available to her, and began formulating a plan of action. The challenges were enormous. She was outnumbered, outgunned, operating in a confined space filled with innocent civilians, at an altitude where any breach of the aircraft's hull would be catastrophic. But she also had advantages that the hijackers didn't know about. They thought they were dealing with ordinary passengers. They had no idea that one of those passengers had spent years training for exactly this kind of high-stakes, high-altitude crisis situation. They didn't know that she had experience with aircraft systems, that she understood the vulnerabilities and capabilities of the Boeing 737 they were flying in. Most importantly, They didn't know that she had faced down death before and won. When Sarah emerged from the bathroom, she had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and the margins for error were terrifyingly small, but it was achievable. The key would be timing, precision, and the element of surprise. She would get exactly one chance to act, and if she failed, everyone on board would pay the price. As she walked back toward her seat, she could see that the situation in the forward cabin had evolved. The blonde flight attendant was no longer visible, presumably having been taken into the cockpit area. The tall hijacker was now positioned near the cockpit door, and Sarah could see the tension in his posture that suggested things were not going exactly as planned. Good. Confusion and stress would work in her favor. The stocky man in the middle section was becoming more agitated, his nervous energy translating into increasingly erratic behavior. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the back of the aircraft, clearly waiting for some kind of signal from his leader. Several passengers in his vicinity were beginning to panic, their fear feeding off his obvious anxiety. It was the calm man in the back who presented the greatest challenge. Sarah could see him watching the developing situation with analytical precision, clearly prepared to adapt his plans as circumstances changed. He had positioned himself where he could monitor everything happening in the cabin while maintaining control over the rear exits. More importantly, he was far enough from the other two that she couldn't neutralize all three simultaneously. But Sarah had an idea about how to use that distance against them. She settled back into her seat, picked up her book again, and waited. The next phase of her plan required patience, and patience was something her military training had taught her in abundance. She would wait for the right moment, the perfect convergence of opportunity and necessity that would give her the best chance of success. That moment was coming soon. Sarah could feel it in the increasing tension throughout the cabin, in the way the hijackers were beginning to show signs of stress, in the growing desperation of the passengers around her. Soon, one of the hijackers would make a mistake, create an opening, provide her with the split-second advantage she needed to act. When that moment came, Sarah Chun would be ready. The woman who had earned her wings in some of the most dangerous skies on Earth was about to prove that even at 35,000 feet, surrounded by enemies, she was still the most dangerous person on the aircraft. The first crack in the hijackers' plan came exactly 18 minutes later, and it came from an unexpected source. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, sitting 3 rows ahead of Sarah with what appeared to be his grandmother, suddenly stood up and announced loudly that he needed to use the bathroom. Right now? The urgency in his voice suggested this wasn't a request that could be delayed. The stocky hijacker in the middle section turned toward the commotion, clearly frustrated by this disruption to their carefully controlled environment. Sarah watched as he approached the boy and his grandmother, his hand still gripping the ceramic knife and the electronic device. The grandmother, a small woman with silver hair and kind eyes, was trying to calm her grandson while obviously terrified by the situation unfolding around them. This was exactly the kind of moment Sarah had been waiting for. The hijacker was distracted, focused on managing a situation he hadn't anticipated. His attention was divided between the child, the grandmother, and maintaining his surveillance of his assigned section of the cabin. Most importantly, he had moved away from his strategic position near the overwing exits. Sarah stood up smoothly, timing her movement to coincide with the hijacker's approach to the boy's row. To any observer, she appeared to be simply stretching her legs, perhaps also waiting to use the bathroom after the child. But her positioning was anything but casual. She had placed herself at the optimal angle to observe both the middle and rear sections of the aircraft while maintaining clear lines of movement toward either target. The boy's situation was escalating. His need was genuine and immediate, and his grandmother was becoming increasingly desperate as she tried to explain their predicament to the hijacker. The man was clearly out of his depth dealing with a child's urgent biological needs in the middle of a terrorist operation. Sarah could see the frustration and confusion on his face as he tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected complication. That's when the calm hijacker in the back made his first mistake. He stood up and began moving forward to assist his associate, leaving his strategic position near the rear exits. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched him break his own operational security to deal with the child situation. Even professional terrorists, it seemed, could be thrown off by the unpredictable nature of civilian passengers. The moment the rear hijacker left his position, Sarah began to move. Her approach was subtle, designed to look like the casual movement of a passenger stretching her legs during a long flight. She walked slowly toward the middle section, timing her advance to coincide with the increasing chaos around the young boy's situation. As she got closer, Sarah could hear the conversation more clearly. The stocky hijacker was trying to explain through broken English that no one could leave their seats, while the grandmother was pleading in what sounded like Spanish for understanding and compassion. The boy himself was beginning to cry, adding another layer of emotional complexity to an already tense situation. The rear hijacker reached the middle section just as Sarah arrived at the periphery of the group. For a moment, all three hijackers were within 15 feet of each other, focused on managing the civilian crisis rather than maintaining their operational security. It was exactly the kind of tactical error that Sarah had been trained to exploit. But, before she could act, another complication arose. From the front of the aircraft came the sound of raised voices, and what might have been a scuffle. The tall hijacker near the cockpit was clearly having problems of his own. Sarah couldn't see exactly what was happening from her position, but she could hear the unmistakable sounds of conflict. Furniture being moved, voices raised in anger and fear, the heavy thud of something or someone hitting the aircraft wall. The two hijackers near her immediately tensed, their attention divided between the child's situation and whatever was happening in the forward cabin. The comm leader reached for what appeared to be a radio or phone, probably trying to communicate with his associate near the cockpit. This was the moment of maximum distraction and confusion that Sarah had been waiting for. She moved with the precision and speed that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations. Her target was the stocky hijacker with the explosive device. Neutralizing him was the absolute priority, since his weapon posed a threat to the entire aircraft. Sarah covered the distance between them in 3 quick steps, using the confusion around the child as cover for her approach. The hijacker sensed movement behind him at the last second and began to turn, but Sarah was already inside his defensive perimeter. Her first strike was to his wrist, a precise blow designed to force him to drop the electronic device. The small bomb clattered to the floor and skittered under one of the seats, momentarily out of reach, but no longer under his immediate control. Her second strike was to his throat, a blow calculated to incapacitate him without killing him. Sarah needed information about their plans, their backup systems, their communication protocols. Dead hijackers couldn't provide intelligence about potential accomplices or secondary attacks. The stocky man collapsed, gasping and clutching his throat, but the ceramic knife was still in his other hand. Sarah grabbed his wrist and twisted, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would force his fingers to open. The knife dropped to the floor with a small clattering sound that was almost lost in the chaos of passenger voices and the ongoing disturbance from the front of the aircraft. The entire sequence had taken less than 8 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Sarah. Her mind was already calculating the next phase of her assault, tracking the position of the leader who was now turning toward her with obvious shock and growing comprehension. She had perhaps 2 seconds before he fully understood what was happening and began to respond. Those 2 seconds were critical. Sarah dropped low and rolled toward the nearest row of seats, putting the aircraft structure between herself and the leader's position. At the same time, she called out in her command voice, the tone she had used to coordinate complex military operations under fire. Passengers down, stay in your seats, and keep your heads low. Flight crew, prepare for emergency procedures. The response was immediate and chaotic. Most passengers dropped down in their seats or crouched in the aisles, following her authoritative commands without question. But a few stood up to see what was happening, creating additional confusion and blocking sight lines throughout the cabin. The grandmother with the young boy was trying to shield him with her body while also attempting to move toward the bathroom, adding to the general pandemonium. The leader hijacker was shouting something in a language Sarah didn't recognize, probably trying to re-establish control over the situation. She could hear him moving through the cabin, but the maze of seats and crouching passengers made it difficult to track his exact position. More concerning was the lack of response from his associate near the cockpit. The silence from the forward cabin could mean he was dealing with his own crisis, or it could mean he was preparing some kind of devastating response to Sarah's attack. Sarah needed to end this quickly before the situation spiraled completely out of control. She emerged from behind the seat row just as the leader was approaching her position, and she could see that he had drawn his own weapon, not a ceramic knife like the others, but something that looked suspiciously like a military-grade combat blade. This man was definitely not an amateur terrorist. They faced each other across a distance of perhaps 10 feet, with scattered passengers between them providing both obstacles and potential human shields. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, the professional assessment of threats and opportunities that she recognized from her own training. This was going to be a very different kind of fight than her quick takedown of the stocky hijacker. "You are not what you seem," the leader said, his English heavily accented but clear. "Military training, yes? Special forces, perhaps." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her posture and positioning answered his question. There was no point in maintaining her civilian cover now that she had committed to action. Instead, she focused on reading his body language, looking for tells that would indicate his next move. "This changes nothing," he continued, beginning to circle slowly around the seats between them. "The operation will continue. My associate in the cockpit has already initiated the final phase. Even if you kill me, you cannot stop what is coming." That statement sent a chill through Sarah's core. The final phase of what? What exactly had they done to the aircraft's flight systems? She needed to get to the cockpit and assess the situation there, but first she had to deal with the immediate threat in front of her. The leader's first attack came without warning, a lightning-fast thrust with his combat knife aimed at her center mass. Sarah deflected the blade with her forearm while simultaneously stepping inside his reach, denying him the space to use his weapon effectively. Her counterattack was a knee strike toward his solar plexus, but he twisted away and the blow only grazed his ribs. They separated and began circling again, both now fully aware of the other's capabilities. This was no longer a terrorist incident with civilian victims. It had become a deadly duel between trained professionals in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. Around them, passengers were screaming and crying, some trying to flee toward the exits, others frozen in terror. The young boy who had started this whole sequence was now sobbing in his grandmother's arms as she tried to shelter him from the violence erupting around them. The stocky hijacker Sarah had disabled was still on the floor, conscious but struggling to breathe properly. Sarah's tactical assessment of the situation was grim. Even if she managed to defeat the leader, she still had to deal with whatever was happening in the cockpit. The hijackers' mention of a final phase suggested they had done something to compromise the aircraft's flight systems, possibly putting everyone aboard in immediate danger regardless of how the fight in the cabin resolved. The leader seemed to read her thoughts. "You begin to understand," he said, pressing his attack with a series of quick strikes that forced Sarah to give ground. "This aircraft is no longer under pilot control. We have uploaded new navigation coordinates that cannot be changed from the cockpit. In approximately 37 minutes, this plane will complete its final flight, with or without my presence." Sarah felt her blood run cold as the implications hit her. This wasn't a traditional hijacking at all. It was a guided missile attack using a commercial airliner. The passengers were never intended to survive, and the hijackers themselves might be on a suicide mission. Everything she had assumed about their motivations and objectives had been wrong. That realization changed her entire tactical approach. If the aircraft was already programmed to crash, then her primary objective wasn't just to defeat the hijackers. It was to regain control of the flight systems before they reached whatever target had been programmed into the navigation computer. She needed to end this fight immediately and get to the cockpit. Sarah began pressing her attack more aggressively, accepting greater risks in exchange for the possibility of a quicker resolution. The leader was skilled, but Sarah had advantages he couldn't match. She had fought in the confined spaces of aircraft before, during training exercises and real combat situations. She understood how to use the aircraft's structure and layout to her advantage. More importantly, she was fighting for the lives of nearly 200 innocent people, while he was fighting for an ideology that valued death over life. That difference in motivation often proved decisive in close combat situations. Sarah feinted left, then spun right, using a row of seats as a pivot point to change her angle of attack. The leader tried to follow her movement, but the confined space worked against him. Sarah's elbow strike caught him in the temple with enough force to stagger him, and her follow-up kick to his knee buckled his leg. As he fell, Sarah grabbed for his weapon hand, twisting his wrist until the combat knife clattered to the floor. But the leader wasn't finished yet. Even as he collapsed, he managed to grab the explosive device that had been dropped by his associate, his fingers reaching for what appeared to be a trigger mechanism. Sarah's final strike was a precise blow to the nerve cluster at the base of his skull, a technique designed to cause immediate unconsciousness without permanent damage. The leader went limp, his hand releasing the electronic device just inches from the trigger. The cabin fell into an eerie quiet broken only by the sobbing of frightened passengers and the steady hum of the aircraft engines. Sarah stood in the aftermath of the fight, breathing hard but already focused on the next challenge. She had defeated the hijackers in the cabin, but, according to the leader's final words, the real battle was just beginning. 37 minutes until the aircraft reached its programmed target. Sarah had that long to figure out how to regain control of a sophisticated commercial airliner whose flight systems had been compromised by professional terrorists. The clock was ticking, and failure wasn't an option. Sarah stepped over the unconscious leader and moved quickly toward the front of the aircraft, her mind already shifting from combat tactics to flight systems analysis. As she approached the forward cabin, she could see the aftermath of whatever struggle had occurred near the cockpit. The galley area was in disarray, with service carts overturned and supplies scattered across the floor. Most concerning was the complete absence of any flight crew members in the forward section. The cockpit door was closed and presumably locked, standard procedure during any security incident. But Sarah could hear voices from inside, at least two people, possibly three, speaking in urgent, heated tones. One voice she recognized as belonging to the tall hijacker, but the others were unfamiliar. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out the conversation through the reinforced barrier. What she heard made her situation analysis even more dire. The hijacker was arguing with someone about schedule adherence and target coordinates, while another voice, presumably one of the pilots, was insisting that the programmed flight path would take them into restricted airspace where they would be intercepted by military aircraft. The hijacker's response chilled Sarah to the bone. Interception was part of the plan. This wasn't just a terrorist attack using a commercial airliner as a weapon. It was designed to trigger a military response that would result in the aircraft being shot down, creating an international incident while eliminating any witnesses to whatever larger operation was unfolding. The passengers weren't just collateral damage. They were intended victims whose deaths would serve a broader strategic purpose. Sarah backed away from the cockpit door and quickly surveyed her options. The standard procedure for dealing with a hijacked aircraft would be to wait for specialized teams trained in aircraft assault techniques. But there was no time for that kind of coordinated response, and even if there was, the hijackers had clearly planned for military intervention. Whatever was happening inside the cockpit, it was designed to be irreversible within the time frame available for rescue operations. She needed to get inside that cockpit and assess the situation firsthand. But the door was designed to resist exactly that kind of intrusion. Post-9/11 security measures had made cockpit doors virtually impregnable from the passenger side, capable of withstanding everything short of explosive charges. And explosives were not an option at 35,000 feet. As Sarah considered her alternatives, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see the blonde flight attendant approaching cautiously from the rear cabin. The woman's face was pale and her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Are you really military?" she asked quietly. "I heard you giving commands back there, and the way you moved, that wasn't civilian training." Sarah made a quick decision. She needed allies, and flight crew members had access and knowledge that could prove crucial. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, United States Navy. I'm a pilot, and I need your help to regain control of this aircraft." "What's your name?" "Jennifer Walsh, Senior Flight Attendant. I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Jennifer's voice was steady now, the kind of professional calm that came from training and experience. "The hijacker took our captain and first officer into the cockpit about 20 minutes ago. We heard some kind of struggle. Then, everything went quiet except for voices." "What kind of aircraft systems do you have access to from outside the cockpit?" Sarah asked, already moving toward the nearest service panel. Her knowledge of commercial aircraft was extensive, but every model had specific quirks and capabilities that could make the difference between success and failure. "Emergency communications, backup power systems, some environmental controls," Jennifer replied, following Sarah's movements. "But nothing that would give us access to flight controls or navigation systems. Those are all isolated in the cockpit network." Sarah nodded, already formulating a new approach. If she couldn't get through the door, and she couldn't access the flight systems from outside the cockpit, then she needed to find another way to influence the aircraft's trajectory. Commercial airliners had redundant systems and emergency procedures that existed outside the normal command structure, designed to function even when primary systems were compromised. "I need you to gather any other crew members and start implementing emergency procedures," Sarah instructed Jennifer. Secure the cabin, make sure all passengers are in crash positions, and prepare for potential rapid decompression. I'm going to try something that might get rough. What are you planning? Jennifer asked, but Sarah was already moving toward the rear of the aircraft, her mind focused on a desperate plan that would either save them all or kill them much more quickly than the hijackers had intended. Sarah's plan was based on a fundamental characteristic of commercial aircraft that most passengers never thought about. They were inherently unstable at high altitude and required constant computer-controlled adjustments to maintain level flight. The flight management systems that kept the aircraft stable and on course were sophisticated, but they depended on data from multiple sensors and input devices throughout the aircraft. If she could disrupt those inputs in a specific pattern, she might be able to force the aircraft into a flight profile that would trigger automatic safety systems. The key was the aircraft's center of gravity and weight distribution. Commercial airliners were designed with careful attention to balance, and even small changes in weight distribution could have significant effects on flight characteristics. Sarah had learned this during her training on large transport aircraft, where cargo loading and passenger placement were critical factors in safe operation. Moving quickly through the passenger cabin, Sarah began implementing her plan. She started by directing passengers to move toward specific areas of the aircraft, redistributing their weight in a pattern that would shift the center of gravity forward and create an unstable pitch condition. Most passengers were still in shock from the earlier violence and followed her authoritative commands without question. Everyone in rows 1 through 15 moved to the back of the aircraft immediately, she called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military command. This is an emergency procedure. Follow the flight attendants and take positions in the rear cabin. Jennifer and the other crew members she had gathered helped coordinate the movement, though Sarah could see the confusion and fear in their faces. They didn't understand what she was trying to accomplish, but they trusted her military authority and expertise. The passengers were more confused than cooperative, but the urgency in Sarah's voice motivated them to comply. As the weight distribution began to change, Sarah moved to the next phase of her plan. She needed to create additional instability by manipulating the aircraft's control surfaces through the only means available to her, the emergency systems that existed outside the hijackers' control. Most passengers didn't know that commercial aircraft had multiple backup systems for emergency situations, including manual controls for certain functions. The emergency slides, for example, could be deployed in flight under extreme circumstances, creating massive drag that would dramatically affect the aircraft's flight characteristics. Sarah knew this was a dangerous gamble. Deploying slides at cruising altitude could cause explosive decompression and structural failure, but it might be the only way to force the aircraft into a flight profile that the hijackers couldn't control. Before she could implement that desperate measure, Sarah heard a new sound that changed everything. The aircraft's engines were powering down. The change in engine noise was subtle at first, but Sarah's trained ear picked it up immediately. The steady roar of the turbofan engines was decreasing in pitch and volume, indicating a deliberate reduction in thrust. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone in the cockpit was manually reducing power, probably preparing for a descent toward whatever target they had programmed into the navigation system. Sarah's time had just run out. Whatever the hijackers were planning, they were beginning their final approach. She needed to get into that cockpit immediately, regardless of the risks involved. She moved back toward the forward cabin, her mind racing through possibilities. The cockpit door was still her primary obstacle, but she had an idea that might work. During her military service, she had learned that even the most secure barriers usually had vulnerabilities that could be exploited with the right knowledge and tools. The key was the door's power source and control mechanisms. Like most aircraft systems, the cockpit door lock was powered by the aircraft's electrical system and controlled by electronic circuits that could be disrupted. Sarah didn't have access to specialized electronic warfare equipment, but she did have something that might serve the same purpose: the aircraft's own emergency systems. Moving quickly to the nearest service panel, Sarah began accessing the aircraft's electrical distribution system. Commercial airliners had multiple power buses and backup systems designed to maintain critical functions even if primary power was lost. But those same systems could be manipulated by someone who understood their interconnections and dependencies. "What are you doing?" Jennifer asked, appearing beside her with obvious concern. "Those are restricted access panels. I'm creating an electrical fault that should disrupt the door lock mechanism," Sarah explained, her hands already working on the circuit breakers and power distribution controls. It's going to cause some system failures and probably trigger a lot of alarms, but it might give us access to the cockpit. Jennifer's eyes widened as she understood the implications. That could affect life support systems, navigation equipment, communication arrays, all of which are already compromised by whatever the hijackers have done, Sarah replied grimly. At this point, we're dealing with a worst-case scenario anyway. Sometimes you have to break things to fix them. Sarah's manipulation of the electrical systems was precise and deliberate, based on her understanding of aircraft power distribution and her knowledge of how security systems integrated with primary aircraft functions. She wasn't randomly disrupting circuits. She was creating a cascade failure that would force the aircraft's computers to prioritize life safety systems over security protocols. The first indication that her plan was working came in the form of warning lights and audio alarms throughout the cabin. Emergency lighting activated, oxygen masks deployed from their overhead compartments, and the aircraft's public address system began broadcasting automated safety messages. But, most importantly, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of the cockpit door lock mechanism cycling through its reset sequence. "Now," she said to Jennifer, moving quickly toward the cockpit door. "We have maybe 30 seconds before the backup systems restore full security protocols." The door handle turned under Sarah's hand, and she found herself looking into the cockpit of a Boeing 737 that was clearly not under normal operational control. The scene inside was chaotic and alarming. The captain was slumped over his controls, apparently unconscious, while the first officer was restrained in his seat with what appeared to be zip ties. The tall hijacker was standing behind the center console, his hands moving rapidly over various control interfaces. "Step away from the controls," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority as she entered the cockpit. "This aircraft is now under military control." The hijacker turned toward her with an expression of surprise and growing anger. "Impossible," he said. "The door systems are hardened against intrusion. You cannot be here." "I'm here," Sarah replied simply, advancing into the confined space of the cockpit. "And you're going to step away from those controls right now." But, even as she spoke, Sarah could see that the situation was more complex than she had anticipated. The flight management system displays showed information that didn't match what she would expect from a normal commercial flight. The navigation computer was displaying waypoints and flight paths that looked like they were taking the aircraft toward a major metropolitan area, and the autopilot systems were engaged in ways that suggested they had been reprogrammed with external software. This wasn't just a case of hijackers manually flying the aircraft toward a target. They had uploaded sophisticated flight management software that was controlling the aircraft's systems at a level that would be almost impossible to override without complete knowledge of their programming protocols. Even if Sarah could disable the hijacker and free the flight crew, regaining control of the aircraft might require more technical expertise than any of them possessed. The hijacker seemed to recognize her growing understanding of the situation. "You see now," he said with grim satisfaction. "Even if you kill me, even if you free the pilots, this aircraft will complete its programmed flight. The software we installed cannot be removed or overridden from these controls. It has become part of the aircraft's core operating system." Sarah's mind raced through the implications as she studied the displays and control interfaces around her. If the hijacker was telling the truth, then traditional recovery methods would be useless. The aircraft had essentially been converted into a large, sophisticated drone, following predetermined programming regardless of human input. But Sarah had spent years working with advanced aircraft systems, including experimental programs that involved automated flight control and computer-assisted navigation. She understood how these systems worked, and, more importantly, she understood their limitations and vulnerabilities. Every computer system, no matter how sophisticated, had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and approach. The question was whether she could identify and exploit those weaknesses before the aircraft reached its target and triggered whatever catastrophic conclusion the hijackers had planned. The clock was still ticking, the engines were still reducing power, and somewhere ahead of them was a target that would soon come into range. Sarah moved decisively into the cockpit, her eyes rapidly scanning the instrument panels while keeping the hijacker in her peripheral vision. The flight management system displays confirmed her worst fears. The aircraft was locked into an automated descent profile toward what appeared to be downtown Los Angeles, with an estimated time to target of less than 22 minutes. "Remove the restraints from the first officer," Sarah commanded, positioning herself where she could monitor both the hijacker and the flight controls. Do it slowly, and keep your hands visible. The hijacker hesitated, clearly calculating his options. Sarah could see him glancing towards something near his feet, probably a backup weapon or another electronic device. Before he could act on whatever he was considering, Sarah stepped forward and grabbed his shirt, using her momentum to slam him against the side wall of the cockpit. I said remove the restraints, she repeated, her voice deadly calm. You have 5 seconds before I decide you're more dangerous alive than dead. The threat had its intended effect. The hijacker reached down and began cutting the zip ties that held the first officer in his seat. As soon as his hands were free, the co-pilot pulled off the tape that had been placed over his mouth and immediately reached for his flight controls. The autopilot won't respond, he said urgently, his voice hoarse from stress and dehydration. They uploaded some kind of software that's overridden all our manual inputs. I'm First Officer Martinez, and I've been trying to regain control for the last 15 minutes with no success. Lieutenant Commander Chun, Navy, Sarah replied, moving to examine the captain who was still unconscious. What's wrong with your captain? Injected with something, Martinez replied, his hands moving rapidly over his instrument panel as he attempted to override the automated systems. Some kind of sedative, I think. He's been unconscious for about 20 minutes, but his vital signs seem stable. Sarah checked the captain's pulse and breathing, confirming Martinez's assessment. The man was deeply unconscious, but not in immediate medical danger. However, his incapacitation meant that she and Martinez were the only qualified pilots available to deal with the crisis, and Martinez's expertise was clearly focused on normal flight operations rather than the kind of system-level programming that the hijackers had implemented. Tell me exactly what they did to the aircraft systems, Sarah said, securing the hijacker with the same zip ties he had used on Martinez. I need to understand their programming before I can figure out how to counteract it. They connected some kind of external device to the flight management computer, Martinez explained, pointing to a small black box that was still attached to the aircraft's central processing unit. As soon as they activated it, all our manual controls became unresponsive. The autopilot engaged and locked us into this descent profile, and none of our override procedures work. Sarah examined the device with growing understanding. It was more sophisticated than she had expected, not just a simple override mechanism, but a complete replacement flight management system that had integrated itself into the aircraft's computer network. The hijackers had essentially performed a hostile takeover of the aircraft's operating system, replacing the original programming with their own software. But Sarah had encountered similar systems during her military service, particularly in her work with experimental aircraft and drone technology. The device was sophisticated, but it was still operating within the constraints of the aircraft's existing hardware and system architecture. That meant it had to interface with the same sensors, communication protocols, and safety systems that the original flight management software used. We need to force the system to recognize a critical failure condition, Sarah told Martinez, her hands already moving over the flight controls as she analyzed the available options. If we can convince the software that the aircraft is experiencing an emergency that requires immediate manual intervention, it might release control back to us. What kind of emergency? Martinez asked, following her movements with obvious concern. Most of our warning systems are already compromised by whatever they've done to the computers. Sarah was studying the engine controls and fuel management systems, looking for a vulnerability she could exploit. Engine failure, she said finally. The software has to be programmed to respond to total engine failure, because that's a condition that requires immediate pilot intervention regardless of flight plan. You want to shut down our engines at 30,000 feet. Martinez's voice reflected the terror that any commercial pilot would feel at such a suggestion. Even if the system releases control to us, we'd be in a glide descent with maybe 15 minutes to find an airport within range. Better than flying into downtown Los Angeles as a guided missile, Sarah replied grimly. Besides, I'm not talking about total engine failure. I'm talking about creating false sensor readings that will make the software think we've lost engine power. Sarah's plan was based on her understanding of how automated flight systems prioritize different types of emergencies. The hijackers' software, no matter how sophisticated, would have to include provisions for catastrophic system failures that could endanger the aircraft. Engine failure was one scenario that no flight management system could ignore, because the physics of flight made immediate pilot intervention absolutely necessary for survival. The key was to manipulate the engine monitoring systems in a way that would trigger the software's emergency protocols without actually damaging the engines themselves. Sarah began working on the fuel flow sensors and engine control interfaces, creating false readings that would indicate rapid power loss in both engines. "This is insane," Martinez muttered, but he was following her instructions and helping to implement the deception. "If this doesn't work, we're going to be in a real emergency instead of a simulated one." "If this doesn't work, we're all dead anyway," Sarah replied, making final adjustments to the sensor inputs. "The software thinks both engines are failing right now." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as the flight management system registered what appeared to be catastrophic engine failure. The automated voice warnings began announcing engine failure and emergency descent required, while red lights flashed across multiple instrument panels. Most importantly, the autopilot disengaged with an audible click, and Sarah felt the flight controls become responsive under her hands. The Hijackers software had recognized the emergency condition and released control back to the human pilots, exactly as she had hoped. "I have control," Sarah announced, immediately beginning to level the aircraft and change course away from Los Angeles. "Martinez, start working on restoring normal engine parameters while I get us headed toward the nearest suitable airport." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that their problems were far from over. The aircraft's navigation systems were still compromised, showing false position data and corrupted waypoint information. The communication radios were either non-functional or broadcasting on frequencies that weren't reaching air traffic control. Most concerning of all, the Hijackers device was still connected to the flight management computer, and Sarah didn't know if her engine failure deception would continue to work indefinitely. "Sarah," Martinez said urgently, "look at the fuel gauges." Sarah glanced at the fuel management display and felt her heart sink. According to the instruments, they had less than 40 minutes of fuel remaining, far less than should have been available for a cross-country flight. Either the Hijackers had somehow dumped fuel as part of their plan, or the software was manipulating the fuel system readings to create additional pressure on the flight crew. "Is that reading accurate?" Sarah asked, already suspecting the answer. "I don't know," Martinez replied honestly. "Nothing on these displays can be trusted anymore. We could have full tanks, or we could be running on fumes. There's no way to verify anything with this software contamination." Sarah made a rapid decision based on the limited information available. "Nearest major airport with long runways and emergency facilities?" "Edwards Air Force Base is about 60 miles northeast," Martinez replied. "But they'll scramble fighters if we approach without proper authorization, and our communication systems aren't working." "Edwards is perfect," Sarah said, already inputting the new course. "I'm qualified for military approach procedures, and they'll have the technical expertise to deal with compromised aircraft systems." As Sarah turned the aircraft toward Edwards, she became aware of new complications developing around them. Through the cockpit windows, she could see contrails in the distance that suggested military aircraft were already responding to their situation. The Hijackers had been right about one thing: their unauthorized flight path and communication blackout had triggered a military response. "We've got company," Martinez observed, pointing toward what appeared to be two fighter jets approaching from the east. F-16s, probably from Edwards or March Air Reserve Base. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she watched the fighters positioning themselves on either side of the commercial airliner. Standard intercept procedures for hijacked aircraft included authorization to shoot down the plane if it posed a credible threat to populated areas. The fighters were there to ensure that Flight 447 didn't reach any potential targets, even if that meant destroying the aircraft with all passengers aboard. "Can you raise them on emergency frequencies?" Sarah asked Martinez, who was working frantically to restore communication systems. "Negative," he replied. "Everything's still compromised. They can see us, but they can't talk to us, and we can't explain what's happening." The situation was becoming desperate. Sarah had regained control of the aircraft and was flying away from Los Angeles, but the military escort didn't know that the hijacking had been thwarted. From their perspective, Flight 447 was still a rogue aircraft under terrorist control, potentially carrying out an attack mission. Sarah's military training included procedures for exactly this type of scenario. She began implementing the visual signals that would indicate to the fighter pilots that the commercial aircraft was under friendly control. The maneuvers were specific and unmistakable: altitude changes, course corrections, and wing movements that spelled out a clear message to any military pilot trained in intercept procedures. The response from the fighters was immediate. One of the F-16s moved closer to the airliner, and Sarah could see the pilot in his cockpit using hand signals to acknowledge her coded message. The immediate threat of being shot down was receding, but they still needed to get the aircraft on the ground and deal with the compromised computer systems. Edwards' approach control is probably tracking us on radar, Sarah told Martinez. Even if we can't communicate by radio, they'll clear the runway for an emergency landing once they understand we're headed their way. But as they approached Edwards Air Force Base, Sarah discovered another complication left by the hijackers. The aircraft's landing systems were malfunctioning, probably as a result of the software intrusion. The instrument landing system wasn't providing accurate guidance, the automatic braking systems weren't responding, and the landing gear indicators were showing conflicting information. "We're going to have to do this manually," Sarah informed Martinez. "Old-school approach, and landing, no computer assistance. In an aircraft we're not even sure is mechanically sound," Martinez asked. "With potentially compromised hydraulics, uncertain fuel status, and a cabin full of passengers who've already been through hell. It's not ideal," Sarah admitted, beginning her approach to Edwards' longest runway. "But it's better than the alternative." As the runway came into view ahead of them, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the past hour. She had boarded Flight 447 as a passenger looking forward to a peaceful vacation. Now she was attempting an emergency landing in a compromised aircraft, with the lives of nearly 200 people depending on her ability to safely bring down a plane that might or might not respond to her commands. The fighter escort was still with them, providing protection and ensuring that emergency response teams were positioned for whatever might happen during the landing attempt. Sarah could see fire trucks and ambulances lining the runway, prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. This was the moment that would determine whether her desperate plan to regain control of the aircraft had been worth the enormous risks involved. In a few minutes, she would know if she had saved the passengers of Flight 447, or if her intervention had simply created a different kind of disaster. The runway was approaching rapidly, and there was no time left for second-guessing or alternative plans. Sarah Chun, the Navy pilot who had been looking forward to reading romance novels on vacation, was about to attempt one of the most challenging landings of her career. The approach to Edwards Air Force Base was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her 15-year military career. Flying a potentially compromised commercial airliner with unreliable instruments toward a runway lined with emergency vehicles, while escorted by fighter jets ready to shoot her down if she made the wrong move, required every skill she had developed as a Navy pilot. "Gear down," Sarah called to Martinez, initiating the landing sequence while fighting controls that felt sluggish and unresponsive. The hydraulic systems were functioning, but not optimally, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to drift off course despite her corrections. "Landing gear indicates down and locked," Martinez reported, though his voice carried uncertainty. "But the gear warning lights are still illuminated. We might have a partial deployment situation." Sarah had dealt with landing gear malfunctions before, but always in military aircraft designed for rough treatment and emergency procedures. Commercial airliners were built to different standards, with safety systems that could become liabilities when those systems themselves were compromised. "We'll know for certain in about 90 seconds, Sarah replied, adjusting her approach angle to compensate for the uncertain gear status. "If the gear collapses on touchdown, we'll belly slide down the runway. Edwards has foam equipment for that scenario." Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see the massive concrete runway of Edwards stretching ahead of them, with emergency vehicles positioned at regular intervals. The fighter escort had peeled off to give them clear airspace for the landing approach, but she knew they were still being monitored by multiple radar systems and were probably on live video feeds being watched by military commanders and government officials. "Passengers secure for landing?" Sarah asked, beginning her final approach sequence. "Jennifer confirms everyone is in crash positions," Martinez replied. "She's done an amazing job keeping people calm after everything that's happened." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the flight attendant who had stepped up during the crisis. Jennifer Walsh had shown the kind of professional competence and personal courage that made the difference between order and chaos in emergency situations. When they got on the ground safely, and Sarah was determined that they would, Jennifer deserved recognition for her crucial role in the survival of Flight 447. The final approach was a delicate balance of speed, altitude, and aircraft attitude that required constant adjustments as Sarah fought the compromised flight controls. The aircraft wanted to drift left, probably due to asymmetric thrust from engines that weren't responding normally to her inputs. The airspeed indicators were giving conflicting readings, forcing her to rely on visual cues and her instinctive feel for the aircraft's performance. 50 feet, Martinez called out, reading from the radar altimeter, which seemed to be one of the few instruments still providing reliable data. 40 feet, 30 feet. Sarah pulled back slightly on the controls, flaring the aircraft for touchdown while preparing for whatever might happen when the landing gear made contact with the runway. If the gear collapsed or failed, she would have to maintain control during what could be a catastrophic slide down several thousand feet of concrete. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. The main landing gear touched down with a solid thump that sent vibrations through the aircraft structure. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah felt the aircraft lurch to the left as if the gear was indeed failing. But then, the secondary touchdown of the nose gear stabilized their trajectory, and she knew they were going to make it. "We're down," Martinez shouted, his voice filled with relief and amazement. "Gear is holding, brakes are responding, we're slowing normally." Sarah maintained control as the aircraft decelerated down the long runway, using reverse thrust and brakes to bring their speed under control. Around them, emergency vehicles were converging on their position, ready to respond to any problems that might develop. The fighter escort had landed at Edwards as well, and she could see other military aircraft taking off, probably to establish a protective perimeter around the base. "Shutdown checklist," Sarah announced as they rolled to a stop near the end of the runway. "Let's get these engines spooled down and secure the aircraft." As the engines wound down to silence, Sarah became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed during the intensity of the emergency landing. Sirens from approaching emergency vehicles, radio chatter from air traffic control, and, most importantly, voices from the passenger cabin, scared voices, relieved voices, but living voices. The hijacking of Flight 447 was over. The passengers were safe, the aircraft was on the ground, and the terrorists had failed in whatever larger objective their mission was intended to serve. Edwards Ground Control. "This is the aircraft commander of Flight 447. Sarah spoke into her radio, relieved to discover that at least some communication systems were working now that they were on the ground. "We have successfully landed with all passengers and crew safe. Request immediate response from explosive ordnance disposal teams and computer security specialists. This aircraft has been subject to terrorist attack, including potential explosives and confirmed software intrusion." The response from ground control was immediate and professional. "Flight 447, this is Edwards Ground. Copy your request for EOD and cybersecurity response. Emergency vehicles are approaching your position. Do not attempt to deplane until the aircraft has been cleared by security teams. Outstanding work getting your aircraft down safely." Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see teams of specialists approaching the aircraft with equipment designed to detect and neutralize explosive devices. Other teams were setting up what appeared to be electronic jamming equipment, probably to prevent any remote activation of devices that might still be aboard the aircraft. "Sarah," Martinez said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. Without your intervention, we'd all be dead right now, along with, however, many people were in their target zone." Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her as the adrenaline from the crisis began to fade. "We're not finished yet," she replied. "Those hijackers were part of something larger, and we need to figure out what that something was before more people get hurt." Even as she spoke, Sarah's mind was analyzing the broader implications of what had occurred. The hijackers had demonstrated capabilities that suggested extensive planning, sophisticated technical resources, and possibly inside knowledge of aircraft systems and security procedures. Their willingness to die in the attack indicated ideological motivation rather than simple criminal intent. Most concerning of all, their plan had included provisions for military intervention, suggesting they had anticipated and prepared for exactly the kind of response that had occurred. This wasn't just a failed terrorist attack. It was intelligence gathering for future operations, a test of response procedures and capabilities, and possibly a diversion from other activities taking place while attention was focused on Flight 447. "Commander Chun," came a new voice on the radio. "This is Colonel Anderson, Base Security Commander. We need you and your crew to remain in the cockpit until our teams have cleared the aircraft. We're treating this as a potential WMD incident until proven otherwise." "Understood, Colonel," Sarah replied. "Be advised that there are 3 suspects aboard this aircraft, 2 unconscious, and 1 who may be conscious by now. All should be considered extremely dangerous and potentially equipped with suicide devices." "Copy that, Commander." Our teams are equipped for hostile suspect recovery. We'll have this situation secured within the hour. As Sarah waited for the security teams to complete their work, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. 12 hours ago, she had been packing for a vacation, looking forward to time away from the stresses and responsibilities of military service. Now she was at the center of what would undoubtedly become a major international incident with implications for national security and aviation safety. But, more than that, she had been reminded of why she had chosen military service in the first place. When innocent people were threatened by those who would use violence to achieve their political objectives, someone had to stand up and fight back. Sarah had spent her career preparing for that moment, and when it came, she had been ready. The first security team reached the aircraft and began the careful process of clearing the cabin and securing the suspects. Sarah could hear voices and movement from the passenger compartment as specialists worked to ensure that there were no remaining threats aboard the aircraft. The process was methodical and thorough, designed to uncover any hidden dangers while preserving evidence that might lead to the identification of other conspirators. Commander Chun, Colonel Anderson's voice came through the radio again. Our preliminary sweep indicates no explosive devices aboard the aircraft, but we're finding sophisticated electronic equipment that appears to be connected to your flight management systems. We're going to need you to brief our technical teams on exactly what occurred during the hijacking. Of course, Colonel, Sarah replied. I'll provide complete cooperation with the investigation. As the security teams completed their work and began the process of allowing passengers to deplane, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Nearly 200 innocent people were alive because she had been willing to risk everything to stop the hijackers. The terrorists' plan, whatever its ultimate objective, had been thwarted. The aircraft and its passengers had been delivered safely to one of the most secure military installations in the country. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. The investigation into the hijacking would reveal connections and implications that extended far beyond Flight 447. The technical capabilities demonstrated by the hijackers suggested resources and planning that indicated a sophisticated organization with long-term objectives. The fact that they had been willing to sacrifice their own lives suggested ideological commitment that wouldn't be deterred by the failure of a single operation. In the days and weeks to come, Sarah would work with intelligence agencies, technical specialists, and security experts to understand the full scope of the threat that had been revealed. She would testify before congressional committees, brief senior military officials, and help develop new procedures for detecting and countering similar attacks in the future. But, for now, as she watched the passengers of Flight 447 walking away from the aircraft under the protection of military security teams, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had been a passenger on a hijacked aircraft, and through training, courage, and a bit of luck, she had helped turn a potential disaster into a successful rescue operation. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun had boarded Flight 447 looking forward to reading romance novels on vacation. She was leaving it as the pilot who had saved nearly 200 lives and helped prevent what could have been one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in aviation history. As the last passenger left the aircraft and Sarah prepared for her own debriefing with security officials, she made a mental note to reschedule her vacation. After everything that had happened, she was definitely going to need those romance novels more than ever. But first, there was work to do. The important work of ensuring that what had happened aboard Flight 447 would never happen again. The hijacking was over, but the fight against those who would use innocent lives as weapons in their political battles would continue. And when that fight required someone with the skills, training, and courage to stand up to impossible odds, Sarah Chun would be ready.